Hello and welcome everyone to today's program, Standard Bearers, Asafo Flags from Ghana, Past and Present, with Dr. Gus Casely-Hayford and Karun Tucker. My name is Katie Fleming and I'm the Gallery Manager and Education Coordinator at the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. And I'm delighted to be co-hosting this event with colleagues Dr. Sandra Sarjono of Tracing Patterns Foundation and Dr. Feely Lee of the Ethnic Arts Council of Los Angeles. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to recognize that the Hearst Museum and UC Berkeley sit on the territory of Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. This land continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band, and we pay our respect by working to transform the museum into a site for justice, inclusion, anti-racist action, and Indigenous knowledge production. So thank you so much for being here. I'm quickly going to go over some Zoom functions before turning it over to my colleagues to introduce our speakers for the day. Today's program is going to feature a discussion followed by a Q&A. You can submit audience questions through the Q&A button that you can find on your screen. It might be on the bottom of your screen or in a menu option, depending on which type of device you're viewing on. Our moderators will pose selected questions at the close of the event, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Feely Lee to begin our introductions.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here to introduce one of our speakers, Dr. Gus Casely-Hayford is a British curator, a cultural historian, a broadcaster, and a lecturer with Ghanaian roots. He's presently the director of the V&A East, which is set to open in 2023. Formerly, he was the director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art in Washington, D.C. He has served in many capacities as an executive director of art strategies for the Arts Council of England and has advised on boards of numerous art institutions. In 2018, he was appointed an officer of the Order of the British Empire for his services to arts and culture. And he has presented several series films for the BBC television program, he has also written 2 books, Timbuktu and Lost Kingdoms of Africa. We're absolutely delighted to have him take away from his very busy schedule and foregoing his dinner tonight to be with us today. To introduce the second speaker, I'd like to have you meet Sandra Sarjono, a colleague of mine. Sandra?
Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us here. It is my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Karun Tucker. He's a collector and researcher of textiles from Asia and Africa, and his mission is to contribute to the wider understanding of post-colonial narratives through cloth. Now, this is a highly personal mission for him, as someone whose family had gone through the traumatic experience of the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947 and had to relocate to Africa and then once again to the UK. So as someone with a mission, Karun collects in order to share them again with the public. And he has done so through numerous collaboration with institutions, museums, and scholars to produce many publications and exhibitions. And his upcoming exhibition will be at the Textile Museum in DC next year on Indian textiles. But Karun doesn't stop just there. He recently established the Karun Tucker Fund, which is run by the Victoria and Albert Museum to support other researchers and makers in the field of Asian and African textiles and dress. So I would like to welcome Karun and Gus, and I'm going to turn the forum to you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you, Feely. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening, but particularly thank you, Karun, who is someone who I have so much admiration and love for, and what he has done for collecting for African textiles for so much in so many different ways is something that I admire him hugely for. And particularly because I have such a deep fondness for this particular area of material culture. I mean, for me, as someone of West African heritage, there's no other family of objects that, at least the families that I know from West Africa, have such an intimate relationship with, such an enduring material link with. The most celebrated African artists, if you think about them, people like Ella Natsui, Yinka Shonabare, they've dedicated so much of their time and practice to celebrating cloth, reminding us something of how, in its very fragility, in its portability, that it is a beautiful metaphor for the very idea of history, of narrative. It's simply unique. And in the right hands, my earliest memories in the right hands are of aunts, aged aunts and uncles using cloth to evoke amazing periods from our conjoined family histories. You know, in the right hands, a faded piece of funeral cloth, wet face, faded from laying on dozens of family coffins over generations during wakes. It became kind of more than just an archaeological remnant, but a kind of way of connecting us to our past, a sort of conjoined sort of material connection to something that would otherwise have been incredibly ineffable. And you could chart across its surface that history, but the actual fabric itself, there was something about it in its very fragility that made it special. So cloth is special in West Africa. Its very fragility, a reminder of the preciousness of history. And I am so delighted this evening to welcome one of the truly great custodians, great collectors, one of the great experts of African cloth, Karun Tucker, who has done an amazing amount to preserve, to protect, to conserve, to promote, to display, and to help us to discover and rediscover the histories of amazing African cloths, and particularly the traditions of Asafo Flags. So I just want to begin, Karun, by asking you about your wider collection and what drew you to Asafo Flags.
Oh, hi, Gus. It's always wonderful to have our conversations, and I see this evening as continuation of what we've been doing for the last few months. Can I also thank all the organizers as well. I have been collecting textiles for almost 40 years now. I started quite young. And in fact, with Asafo Flags, I came to them quite late. By that, I mean about 25 years ago. So I was on my trip to Cape Coast, and a friend of mine who took me to see a very elderly gentleman, and he took out sort of this folded brown paper. It was so, the paper had been used so much, it was like holding vellum. And in that, he had wrapped some Asafo Flag fragments, and he knew about me as a collector. Obviously, my friend had spoken to him about it, my collecting interest, and he said he'd save these and he would only sell them to me. Oh. So I think that was almost the first time that I saw those fragments, very fragile fragments, through the eyes of the man who was showing them to me. And it really made me focus on them, I think, and that was really the moment when I truly fell in love with Asafo Flags. And that man really showed me, it was quite a horrific day, Gus, for me, because I'd been to see the Cape Coast Castle, and you know what it's like. It's a very emotional place because it was the last place a lot of African people saw before they were enslaved and put on ships. So just having that contact with him, emotionally, it was a very important moment for me in my life as well. And it also was an introduction to Asafo Flags. So that's how I really started. And so that was my big one.
It's a beautiful story, and that connection to that bit of the coast. And you know, I was born in London, but I, like you, was drawn to that bit of the West African coast, and it is a deeply compelling area, not just for its culture, but also for its history, and that the flags wrap those two things together incredibly powerfully. I was born in Britain, and the British, their first contacts with this bit of the coast in the 16th century, that they are driven by this idea of wanting to build really deep-rooted trading contacts. And so there are kind of trading pioneers, people like Francis Drake and John Hawkins, and across the period of the sort of 1560s, they begin to build some quite profound contacts on this bit of the West African coast. And over decades, that he, particularly Hawkins, would begin what would create a very established set of trading routes, of bringing trade goods from Europe, trading them on the coast of West Africa, and then trading enslaved peoples across the Atlantic. And it's a trading triangle that becomes incredibly, over the next 300 years, it sort of drives what would be today many billions of pounds worth of investment back to Europe, taking it away from West Africa. But the way in which the Europeans fortify and actually make sure that they can control this is through a range of castles and fortified buildings along the West African coast. And these castles become the basis not just of trade, but also of deep-rooted cultural relationships. And the Fante, who you know, I am a kind of a son of the Fante, that they build this symbiotic relationship with the British, trading with them, but also as middlemen with the people who live in the interior, trading kind of cloth and gold, but also allying with them when necessary or militarily. And in this way, they develop this institution, part military, part culture, Asafo meaning war people. And there are kind of mutual benefits in these relationships. But one of the incredible manifestations of it is these gorgeous Asafo flags, which could be used militarily, as one would use company flags in that period on the battlefield in Europe, but also as ways of linking families and community, and as a way of connecting people to their history. And they are absolutely gorgeous things, but with this long, rich, complex history that is bound to this moment of exchange and interchange. And what I mean, Karun, what are your sort of favorite areas of focus of this huge area of cultural practice?
I mean, I don't tend to have favorites, because for me, I just love them as objects, and I only also acquire pieces that I like. So if we look at it, sort of the Pelican Flag we've got on the screen now, I mean, that's quite interesting, because I acquired that in mid-90s in Ghana. And then I gave it to my friend Alistair McAlpine. And then it was, I don't know if you can see the catalogue of his auction.
Oh,
so
yeah.
That was auctioned off in 2007. And then I don't know where it was for 12 years, but I was lucky enough to buy it back a few years ago. So, and if we look at the next couple of slides as well, because to me, what these flags show, I mean, as you talked about, some of them were made to, people have these myths that they were there to incite conflict, to rile each other. That was part of the case, obviously. But then if you look at this flag, which is on a felt background, a European felt, 19th century one, which clearly shows the trade. There's a European figure with a hat on who's giving the guns to an African figure. So not were they only just recording sort of tales to for rival companies to rile them and to bring them into conflict. They were also recording histories, they were recording other events, they were recording the things we'll just talk about later, about the technologies which were taking place. And also, I think you mentioned the whole trade with Europe and what was happening in 17th century and so forth. I mean, we'll come to that later because I can actually link them with the flags that we've got, which actually show that trade of cloth, that cloth you talked about very importantly, linking those flags to the aesthetics and the arts that they were using. But I think in terms of looking at that as objects of art, if we look at next few slides, I mean, I think they are sort of, I mean, this is the sort of post-independence flag, for example, and the proverb there is quite obvious that we are very strong, that we use the cactus as a cushion to carry our water in a basket. So not only are they saying they could use cactus and also carry the water in a basket, so they're that strong. So you know, interesting proverb and very clear. But if we look at next few flags, what to me is, I mean, look at this amazing 19th century flag,
Beautiful.
which is about total abstraction. It's not a patch which has been done later. It's on both sides, like most flags are. So it's, and if we look at some of the couple of other ones, it just shows the whole, I mean, this is one of the earliest flags I have, I think, in my collection, I would say mid-19th century. And I mean, we talked about different colonial powers which were ruling. So we had the Portuguese, we had the Dutch, we had the English. So, I mean, this flag on the right depicted could be a depiction of the Portuguese flag. I mean, we don't know, we need to do more research on that. But what I am fascinated about is the sophistication of the playing field in these objects. I mean, and I think one of the things you've talked about in the past is Hegel quoting about the whole notion of African art being primitive and so forth. But when we look at these very complex designs, it's showing us how sophisticated that art form had become. And we're looking at a 19th century piece. So while there is written evidence to say flags were around in 18th and 19th century, I mean, I think the history could go back to 17th century. I mean, obviously a lot of work needs to be done, because to achieve this kind of sophistication in form, in a picture play, and also we're talking about an art form, I mean, we're seeing flat images, but we're talking about double-sided flags. So if you actually hold one and the same image is done on both sides, so appliques are done on both sides. So you have to imagine the image, which is double-sided. And also, I mean, when you see them in actual movement, so the actual field is moving. So it's a very sophisticated art form that we're confronting. And for me, it's one of the most sophisticated art forms to have come out of Western Africa on cloth.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. And you know, as you say, that it is kind of shocking, that sort of that European conception of Africa being this place which is devoid of culture, of history, of sophistication. And one looks at this sort of work, which is so exquisite, but is also so invested in the idea of historical narrative as well, the idea of passing on tradition and history, and of linking people to place and to tradition. The very idea that Africa would be a place that somehow would be sort of tabula rasa and without culture. And one looks at this as, for me, I think, as the kind of a very powerful material piece of evidence that speaks to very, very, as you say, Karun, very, very sophisticated understanding of history and heritage.
Yeah, and also, I think another thing which is very important with this is, I mean, if you look at it in terms of pure art, sort of the plasticity of figures in them, and I mean, they play with scale sort of huge birds. If we look at next image, to me, this is pure Zen in terms of the choices the artist made, leaving all that space blank. And in fact, this kind of format is, I think, the earliest form of surviving Asafo Flags. So they are 19th century, where you have a big plain and very small scale figures. And also, this very interesting fact about some of the colors being used and some of the designs, because following sort of disturbances within different companies in Asafo, the Cape Coast government, for example, in 1909, they passed a ruling. They actually allocated some of the colors and designs to different companies. So, for example, number 1 company were only allowed to produce, well, they could use red-brown color. So that was only specifically for number 1 company. And they could use certain images, for example, a rainbow, a whale eating a man. So it's really interesting that they tried to bring in those rules. But obviously then other companies who tried to tease the others and brought in designs which copied them. So there's that going on at the same time as well.
Absolutely beautiful. Could we look at the next one, please? And you mentioned Hegel and that idea of historical narrative, and one of the kind of ways in which I think you can really sort of read the investment in the idea of narrative is through some of the actual sorts of stories that are depicted in the flag. So often you will see whales, and whales speak to a very kind of particular tradition of storytelling. It's the idea of the sea, of course, being incredibly deep, but the idea of history itself being a reservoir within which one might actually dive, a kind of resource within which one might immerse oneself to actually find all sorts of treasures. And in that very period when Hegel was writing that, you know, Africa was a place that was devoid of history, Osai Bonsu was, he was the Santahini, and his name alongside Osai Bonsu that he was known by was the whale. And the idea was, as this king of the Asante region, that he had this level of wisdom that would mean that he could dive deep and he could actually kind of take in this huge body of knowledge like a whale. But what I think I find particularly powerful about it is this idea that it's a wonderful metaphor, but it's the idea that even though this man was hugely powerful, hugely respected, it was his knowledge. It wasn't his armies. It's not his wealth. It's his knowledge. It's this idea that he was a man of great wisdom that he was most respected for. That is the area within which he sought to really claim his legitimacy. And so you have this body of flags, even though the Asante are rival and neighbors and powerful, they have the same sets of images of the whale being connected to history, to narrative, to the idea of continuity, to the idea of knowledge being incredibly important.
Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful flag as well. It just captures what you've been saying. And also, I think if you look at the scale again, some of the things I've mentioned, you've got a tiny ship with this cannonball which has been fired, and the whale has captured that in its mouth. So, and you have embroidery in this flag as well. So this spouting water on top that you see has been embroidered. So there are various techniques being used there. So it's not just appliqué, and it's just visually just a beautiful piece. Also, I think you've talked, Gus, in the past about the, if you look at the next flag, about notion of communities and so forth. So we've got a series of flags that would be nice to talk about those issues.
And this again speaks to the power of narrative, but also of key central figures. So of the chief or of the head of a family who is suckling the community. And it is, again, it speaks to that same narrative of like the whale, of these kind of central powerful figures who give birth to, who are full of knowledge, who are in some way actually helping the community to thrive through sharing what they have. And so this particular kind of figure, this sort of breasted figure, which is both male and female, who is actually sharing the knowledge, the love, sharing the continuity and the connectedness of community, is very, very central to the Asafo tradition. And so these are matrilineal communities, but with very, very strong male central figures. And so you have these sorts of figures who are both male and female, who actually nurture in a kind of complex set of ways that speak to both male and female ways of protecting and nurturing. And I think that's part of what is powerful about the Asafo, is that it's something which truly embodies both family and community, and does that through drawing this protective arm around everyone, and doing it through knowledge and history, and making people feel that they are secure within the arms of this amazing feeling of community.
Yeah, and I think the next two flags sort of re-emphasize a lot of what you're saying.
Yes, and so one of the words that people use for that figure is the abuatan, the water pot, and here this idea of the water pot, the reservoir, that is again being referred to. Sorry, Karun.
Yeah, and if we look at the next one, I mean, that's quite an interesting flag, because if you notice, there's no star in the Ghana flag on the left, so we can sort of date it quite specifically to 1964 to 66. And also, I mean, we haven't talked much about artists, because obviously there are various schools and some very well-known artists. This one, for example, was done by Kwamina Mauku, we think, because he did all the embroideries on outside of the figures. So it's really important for us to study all the collections that exist, so we can try to identify other artists. I mean, there's obviously the great book, the Art, Honor and Ridicule, done by Rom, which has sort of areas of study where they did field works and so forth. But that book and a lot of the collections I know are quite narrow in their perspective, because they are looking at a section of flags made in a certain period. So, I mean, what I've tried to do is to buy really early fragments, no matter how damaged they were, so that we can really start looking at who the makers were, and to start looking at different schools, because certainly the Salt Lake School and so forth, I mean, like the Pelican Flag we saw at the earlier, are very popular because of their images. So they're very popular with dealers and collectors. But for me, my aesthetics and my whole ethos is to give a full picture. And some of these flags are now studying them and also looking at the images and the way they're constructed. We can try to identify different artists. And if we look at the next one, for example, I mean, I also think that there are certain makers. I mean, some flags are so odd. I think they're just totally one-off. So I'm not sure if there were people who just made few, or very few of their work survived. So I think it may have been a much larger industry than we think at the time. And in this one in particular, we talked about colonialism a bit. So obviously you're getting the whole images of colonialism becoming very much part of the Asafo aesthetics. As I mentioned earlier, the flags may have started in 17th century, certainly we know 18th and 19th century. So I think it is talking about trade as well, and it is for me a sort of unique art form. So the only thing I can compare it with is that if we look at Indian chintz trade, which was in 17th century, what you had Europeans, East India Company taking designs to India, to Indian artists, and asking them to interpret. So you had sort of a new aesthetics almost forming. And I think for me, that is what was happening with the Asafo Flags, because they were looking at everything around and taking on contemporary images and historical images, and then giving us something quite new. So it's like giving birth to a new form of art. And it is very much linked with colonialism. So if we look at the next image, for example, that the trade that you touched on, Gus. So this flag I found in Accra about 20 years ago. It's fascinating because the ground cloth they've used is Indian tie-dye silk,
Wow.
which would be, I think, about late 19th, early 20th century, which fits with the iconography of a sort of royal figure, which has echoes of European royal figures. So, I mean, we got records of ships from, for example, the trade in 19th century that we've touched on, the whole records of slave ships. So in 1701, there was some documentation of what sort of swaps they made for cloths. So they were actually trading. They were trading chintz, handkerchief, rumals from Manchester, India, for people in Africa. So so those are records that exist that we can look at. But also what the trade meant. I mean, it's quite complex to talk about colonialism, how that worked in those times. So in 1700, there was a lot of chintz and cotton coming from India to Europe, and it was because of the dyeing process and so on, it was easy to wash, keep clean, so that became very popular. So the weavers in Europe, there was a storming of Parliament in UK, weavers storming the Parliament, so there were laws enacted in 1701, and then later on to stop the import of Indian chintz and cotton. I mean, they weren't very effective, but obviously we know how East India Company operated, so they started looking for markets abroad. So West Africa was a huge, big market. So they started trading a lot of cloth there. And this is the result we see now, the flag in front of us. And if we look at the next one, because that one, as I said, is the Indian cloth background.
Wow,
so this
wow. That is so gorgeous.
Yeah, it is beautiful, but it's also fascinating in the sense that this is an Indonesian batik cloth, we think, although I have been told it could be a German cloth, but same date production, 19th century. So what the flag makers, which I keep going back to because they were really like contemporary artists, they were looking at what was around them and taking new material. So what they have done is applied cockerel on it and the cockerel actually has a felt on it, which is English felt, 19th century. So you've got potentially Indonesian batik, English felt, the Union Jack, so on this, very busy background. And then if we look at the next image, which is again about trade. So this fascinating image, because they've taken a Victorian handkerchief or a cloth with the portrait of the Queen, and so they've cut it to cover the seat of the royal family sitting there. And it's same on both sides. So they must have had two portraits. So I think what I'm trying to say, if you look at that piece and you look at any contemporary art practice, mean, it is so sophisticated for me to take an existing image and repurpose it. And if we look at the next image, we see that again. So this is a fascinating flag for me. Again, I mean, as you know, a lot of my flags are fragments. So this is quite damaged one. So for the show, which is online, we repaired them digitally. And we've got a cloth here, which is Victorian Manchester cloth as the background. And on top of that, they've appliqued a cockerel, which is again a European cloth. And what you can't see is they've done some very elaborate embroidery on the cockerel. So you've got these European cloth. Then you've got felt, which is being used for the Union Jack. But the red elephant on the bottom left, we've got very few patches of red silk left, which again is Indian tie-dye silk. Amazing. So not only are we looking at a very sophisticated image and composition that an artist has put together, we're also looking at the whole trade that we've talked about from 17th century to 19th century, and moving not only people, for example, from Africa to be enslaved, but moving goods. And also we know the whole blocking of the whole production of Manchester cotton that this flag is made from was only enabled because they stopped the production of cotton in India. So they made it impossible to be made there with huge taxes and laws. So the cotton was coming to Manchester, and then the cloth being made there, then the cloth was going back to Asia as well as Africa, so that all the monies would still come back to the colonized communities. So this, through one flag, we can trace all those things. So if we look at the next image, wow, that's the artist that you met.
Yes, so this is Kabina Badawa, who is one of the great Asafo flag makers and one of the most sort of beautiful people I've ever met as well. That I met him when I was actually writing my PhD, and then again I made a film about Asafo flags and interviewed him. And he is someone who across much of the 20th century was seen as being one of the great Asafo flag makers. And in his last, I'd say 20 years, the great Asafo flag maker. And he makes huge flags like this one, which are really kind of large in scale. But he also makes some of the most beautiful and significant Asafo flags, incredibly graphic, beautifully selecting and crafting very, very precise images, cutting them almost like sort of those Matisse cutouts of placing very, very kind of stark colors one against another in a very deliberate way. And he does it in such a way that it absolutely looks back at traditions that we would have known of Asafo flag making, but he makes absolutely the art form his own. And subsequently, there are many other flag makers who follow him, who look back on his practice as being possibly the golden era. I mean, he is incredible, and it was a great privilege to meet him and to meet some of the people who actually trained underneath him. But this is an exquisite piece. Karun, can you tell us a little bit about it, its scale and some?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite large because I think it's over, 8 meters long. Obviously, a processional flag, and double-sided again. I mean, what I love about, as you say, Gus, is the beautiful simplicity of the drawing, of the figures on it. And to me, it is as sophisticated as you mentioned, Matisse cutouts. But this, what I particularly love about this piece is the way the river is depicted and how it becomes the sea at the end. I just think it's just so beautifully done, because you've got the fish in the river, then sort of a bit of sand is implicated, and then it becomes the sea. And there's also another next flag is by him as well, the artist you knew. And that, I mean, it just leaves you speechless. The way depiction of the tree is just exquisite. And then obviously you have the leopard. Again, use of fabric, which already has the spots, and then there's embroidered viscous eyes, and there's a lot of embroidered on the royal figure on the left. So it's like pure, very simple design. His work really stands out, doesn't it, Gus? So that it's just really simplistic and bold.
But and it speaks to the traditions of Asafo flag making over the previous 200 years that we know he's pared back the image of the Supi sitting upon the stool into these very kind of this very deliberate pose that would become kind of very much part of a Kabina Badawa kind of palette of ways of dealing with the seated form. And then the tree as well, that these particular sacred trees that people would sit under, that were kind of again about sort of rooting people in particular places and tradition, and then on the right hand side, that this figure that of a cat that speaks to all sorts of traditions that link the flag making traditions back to those European companies where military companies in which these kinds of insignia would have been very kind of well known, but here evoking something which is absolutely kind of part of a West African tradition. And he's understood all of these things and he's made them his own. This is in a period in which he would have been aware of the work of Matisse and Picasso, and he would have been aware of the ways in which people around the world are kind of playing with dimension and form, and he would have been aware of it. He knew all of that stuff, and yet wanted to both evoke something of a particularly West African tradition, but also to absolutely kind of render it within this period in the 20th century, when there was so much burgeoning change within kind of our understanding of culture. I think he is as in terms of great artists that I've met, that he is one of the people that I feel probably the greatest privilege in having spent time with.
Yeah. Also, we talked about technologies, what was happening in Ghana at the time. So I think next few flags, I wanted to focus on so perhaps you want to talk about that one.
No, this is one of my favorite particular kind of bodies of flags, and it speaks to a particular moment in Asafo flag making tradition, but also in Ghanaian history, that this tells a story as well of not just flag making or of the Fante, but also of colonialism. If you think that across the narrative arc of this period of flag making, there was always the ongoing encroachment and control of the British, and then with that moment at the kind of beginning of the First World War, of the British beginning to renegotiate their relationship with their many kind of areas of the empire, because realizing if they were going to win this war, they would have to forge a different kind of relationship with their colonial citizens. So they asked for volunteers, they asked for donations for the military. And one of the very kind of powerful ways in which people give back is that they actually donate to a scheme to send reconnaissance planes into battle. And in this period, the use of biplanes is quite a new sort of military technology. And so it gives the British huge advantage where they can be deployed. But because one, the pilots last literally days, and two, the plane technologies were kind of, fairly early, that they were constantly looking for ways to raise money for new planes. And so on the Gold Coast, there are a number of campaigns in which people raise money to deliver planes as part of the military campaign. And Nana Ofori-Atta, who sits on the Legislative Council, he is one of the big chiefs, and he actually donates enough money to sponsor a plane, and he has his name emblazoned across the side of it, and it actually makes the newspapers in Britain. And I think at that moment, the Asafo companies, they realized the kind of power of this kind of investment. And in Cape Coast and many of the sorts of areas along the coast, they too begin to raise money. And I think about half a dozen planes are actually sponsored by the peoples of the Gold Coast. And in this period, lots of flags then begin to be made to depict what is their contribution. And of course, they send troops. And there is an expectation with this commitment that the British will begin to renegotiate their relationship with the peoples of the Gold Coast.
Yes, so it's really important that, that iconography started coming into flags. And if we look at the next few images, I mean, this is really interesting one, Gus, because it's very specific. It's US mail. So, yes. And it's
that's a specific image, though, isn't it? It's a specific plane. It's a very particular, and it is if one kind of Googles and you have a look, you know the images that the flag maker is actually basing this upon, and the moment in which this is seen as being really kind of critical aviation technologies that are transforming communication and making the world a smaller place, and bringing about the sense that the sorts of inequalities and terrible things that are happening in places like the Gold Coast, that they cannot go unnoticed. I mean, that this is a moment in which the world becomes a single family, and the sense of misjustice that many people are feeling, people feel that they are actually going to be listened to.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I find it quite fascinating because US airmail flights were happening between 1911 and 18 for an artist to have picked up that image, and the flag dates from that sort of period.
Yes,
also, if we look at the next one, which is what you've just talked about, communications, the wireless, telegraphs that people are able to send. So you've got this amazing fragmented piece, which is showing that.
If you think in the middle of the 19th century that gold is being panned in handfuls, but there's a kind of a moment of massive transformation of industry on the Gold Coast, and within a kind of handful of decades, 250,000 ounces are being exported from the Gold Coast, and that's alongside manganese and bauxite and diamonds, and huge range of different kinds of goods. And these new industries, that they need new roads and railway systems and new systems of communication. And so you see massive transformation, and those things are absolutely captured in the flags. I mean, here you can see telegraph systems, and it's about technology, burgeoning technology, transforming the lives of people on the coast, and the possibility of a different kind of Gold Coast actually begins to kind of hove into the minds of the people.
just to sort of touch back on what I've been saying about, so if you look at any contemporary artist, they're looking at what's around them, they're looking at new materials, images. So just to reiterate that, so every image we've seen reinforces the importance of these flags. But I just wanted to talk to you, Gus, a bit more about the role of museums. Obviously you're setting one up in Vienna East. And I was particularly fascinated because British Museum asked Grace and Perry, there's the exhibition called The Tomb of the Unknown Craftsman. So the idea was to look at existing objects in the collection and produce some work or do something with them. So what Grace and Perry did was, I don't know if you're familiar, he used Asafo Flag as a template and made some flags. And they were displayed, hung like Asafo Flags and so forth. And I went to the show, there was a show in Serpentine Gallery. And, they were being sold for a few thousand, they sold out straight away. And now they're, 10,000 more each.
Wow.
So I have a problem with that because obviously the Tomb of the Unknown Craftsman, the idea was to highlight African arts, the unknown people we've been talking about, some we know, obviously. So when museum commissions something like this, so who is it benefiting?
Yes.
It's sort of, there's some really complex questions we need to be asking. Who is it ultimately? Does it really make those flags people more aware about the Asafo Flags? Because, through my Instagram account, for example, people have asked me, have people started copying Grayson's flags in Ghana, the new ones they see? So it's sort of really complex questions. What do you think?
And as someone who's worked in museums all my professional life, I do find that frustrating. But I do think that there is a moment of reckoning in which we must begin to rectify some of these terrible kind of omissions, areas of fragility within our narrative understanding of the past. And one thinks about kind of the early 20th century of those great modernist artists wandering into places like the Palais de Trocadero and seeing African art and it transforming the practice of people like Picasso and Matisse, of them, and then Picasso himself, when being asked about that work, of saying, oh, my masks, they were witnesses to my genius rather than points of inspiration. And I think, even though I'm sure Grayson wouldn't have felt that, I do feel that we absolutely now owe a debt to this great body of work, to the people who created them, many of them unnamed. We know that we must now invest in the scholarship, in trying to find the ways of reconstituting those histories, of, as you are doing, incredible work of where possible, of conserving and restoring these works, and of reinvesting in areas in which I think we all feel that there has been a huge omission. And it's a great time of opportunity. And I feel here that we, should all come together wherever we can and try and support the endeavor of trying to rectify what I think is a huge area of omission.
Yeah, I think also, museums, as you know, I collect from all sorts of areas. African textiles are one of the areas which I think museums are at least 2 decades behind. I had my show at Brunei Gallery, and we have got some of the most wonderful weavings from the world, and museums simply don't want to know them. So it's something which has to be rectified. And also, I think it's something, what you've just mentioned. If you go to Paris Art Week, for example, they're still talking about primitive art.
Yes.
We're in 2021, and we're looking at how sophisticated this art form is and how African art has informed the most important artists of the 20th century. So to talk about African art as some sort of primitive, tribal, sort of putting it in a certain category. And also it's what's really fashionable, particularly with these flags, people talk about them as outsider art. I mean, this is not outsider art, as we've discussed for the last hour. It's an art form which may have continued from 17th century to now. So it's very important to recognize that. And also, I think museums have a duty. It's no longer about returning few items. It's, what are you going to give back to those communities in Africa where those things have been taken away for hundreds of years? So, through my small scholarship, we're funding even small exhibitions in villages in Asia or Africa. So what are we going to return to the next generation? Because it's a generational thing. How are we going to inspire the next generation in Africa, Asia, and Europe and other countries? Because we're looking at sharing these images and iconography. And also, I think one of the things we've talked about in the past when we met is how much of the images of Asafo Flags are around us, how much that artwork is already being used. And we see in our daily design or so, but obviously it's not being recognized as a source. And so those credit needs to be given. And so I feel quite passionate about that. And museum collections should no longer be about, in the past, it was 19th century curators who went, mainly men, to buy what was available. So a lot of work by women was totally missed. So there's gaps in museums in the vesting collection. So we need to have shows where they're showing all the arts of Africa, and not also this danger of, museum just working with a dealer who's giving their stories, who have their own motives. So you see shows which are very limited with wrong caption dates. So all that work needs to happen, and we're way behind on doing that.
But also to see the flags flown, to understand that richer context, to work with museums actually in Ghana, in Africa, to find the ways of strengthening the the infrastructure there. I do feel that there is now it is incumbent upon institutions in the West to give back in a variety of different ways, and and to see that as being a privilege rather than something which is onerous. And so I look forward, at V&A, to finding the ways in which we can continue as we began to build those sorts of partnerships and to develop a more equitable future. As I think someone like Kabina Badua, I think it would have been his dream to see both his work on display in the West, but also for the traditions of Asafo to be respected and maintained actually on the coast of West Africa.
Yeah, and also, we've obviously talked about flags, but we talk about Akan arts. There's the jewelry, for example, the ring I'm wearing. There's other arts we need to encompass as well from those regions. Yeah.
But perhaps we should, we've got company, so perhaps we should open up to some of the questions, the thoughts, the ideas of our many guests.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Karun and Gus, for this stimulating discussion. And I think we can continue discussion outside, the Zoom. But yeah, we have a lot of questions already coming in. One of them is about the history about the tradition of the flag, whether that was something that was already there within the culture, or was it something that was copied because of the colonial presence?
So they are, if you imagine in the 16th century, that when Europeans went into battle, that they broke their armies down into military companies, into discrete companies. Each company would have at least one, possibly a number of different flags that on the field of battle would mark them out, so that the generals could both know where their companies are, but also apportion orders to the different divisions. And then you could imagine that when the British travelled, that tradition of companies travelled with them. And so the Asafo companies actually mirror that as a tradition, but within a handful of generations of adopting these sorts of military company traditions of flag making, they became something which was its own. So they have the format of the Union flag very often in the corner, but the actual things which are depicted are not about definitely connoting a loyalty to the British, that they fulfill a whole range of different kinds of function. And so the tradition then kind of goes on a narrative arc in which those flags would very often be used to rail against the British. And indeed, many of the flags were confiscated because they were seen as being kind of symbols of hostility. And so it's quite an interesting arc in which they kind of, in part, are inspired by British traditions, or European traditions, but they absolutely become something which is driven by indigenous practice, and then inform something which is absolutely kind of seen as being anti-colonial.
Yeah, so Karun, I'm actually interested in the material, because so if they want to assert their kind of cultural tradition, Africa has a great tradition of raffia weaving, right? But is there any flags that were made with raffia?
Yeah, I mean, there isn't a tradition of raffia weaving in West Africa. So there is in East Africa. So there are a couple in my collection because there's some with Mali blanket cloth as a background. So I have got some with the raffia background. Yeah.
There's a question about the first image, the first flag, about the pelican with the fish, and what's the meaning for that?
Let's not focus too much on meaning, but that's basically about do the right things, because the pelican's eating the fish with the tail, so the bones would get stuck in it. So it's basically saying, if you want a job done, do it the right way, roughly.
Okay. There's a question about region. Geographically, are we starting from in Ghana, coastal or central?
So this is Ghana on the coast, the center of the coast, which is the Fante area. So many of the sorts of people would have been fishermen, farmers, but they would have come from that sort of southern Ghanaian area.
Thank you. And is there a connection between the abstract Asafo and Adinkra flags, which can be visual representation of abstract ideas?
You mean Adinkra cloth? I mean, there are Adinkra cloth, which are, it's interesting because we talked about, artists using different technologies and different techniques. So Adinkra are basically cloths that are stamped. So there is no connection, but I have got some flags in the collection that they've used stamps as well. Yeah.
Okay, and this is a question for Karun. When are you going to publish or speak about your collection of purba? And
oh God, purba, they're in my kitchen in London. I have, yeah, that's sort of one of many collections I have. So I have no plans to publish them, but they will end up in a museum like most of my collections. So.
Gus, you mentioned about the name of several artists. I think few people wanted you to reiterate the names. I remember there were the name of the artist who did the blue, really large flag, very long one, as well as the one with the big man and the tree, the sacred tree.
Yes. So Kabina Badawa, he is born, I think, in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. So he grows up in this kind of period in which there's a huge railing against the British. And so the National Congress of British West Africa establishes itself as a body which is pushing back against colonialism. That would have begun in his formative years, would have been middle-aged at the point of independence of Ghana. And so by the end of the century, when he dies, he has basically seen the narrative arc from kind of, you know, the bitterest kind of colonialism to freedom, and Ghana really beginning to thrive. And his flags tell that story. His flags kind of depict this sort of burgeoning nation that is always kind of confident. I mean, that's the incredible thing, is that you know, the British, that they, even when they kind of take over in Kumasi and they found a colony, and they demand the golden stool of Asante, the local people, they recognize, you may have actually have taken our king, but it's the material culture around which we will build a sustained narrative, and they refuse to give up the golden stool. And I think, to some degree, within Asafo, you see, within these flags, you see that kind of defiant tradition of feeling this is the space within which we are crafting a really powerful sense of ourselves. And Kabila Badawa knows that, and he recognizes that in his work, he is telling a story of a nation, a proud nation that is coming into being. So if you get the chance to see a body of his work, and you begin to get a sense of the chronology, you also have an understanding of something of the story of not the middle class, not the kind of bureaucrats, not the colonials, but a story of what it was like to live through that colonial period, and to actually see freedom and everything that came beyond it. So it's a beautiful body of work and an incredible human being. And I'm just so sad that he wasn't, you know, alive to see his flags being celebrated across the world.
So to follow up on that, who are the contemporary Asafo flag maker today? And is this still a very much living tradition?
It is. I mean, there's a younger generation. One of his acolytes, Kofi Nkum, who is now sort of in sort of late middle aged, is a great flag maker who learned from Kabila Badawa, and that he has, you know, looked to train a number of others. And it is now kind of seen as being, even though Asafo as a tradition is not as richly celebrated as it once was, but I think there is a recognition within Ghana of how important this tradition is in telling a story which would otherwise have been completely erased from history. And that, I think, is for most peoples of African descent, the frustration of our histories are so often just sort of, you know, that they disappear. And what this body of work has done is to tell the story from our perspective, but also it's the story which reflects not the middle class version of resistance, but the ways of building those connections between those contemporary flag makers and this tradition of telling the sorts of stories that we see, you know, amazingly depicted in Karun's collection. I think we tell a story of Africa which is it's very rare, and I think it's very important.
Yeah, I find this Asafo Flags.
I'm sorry, and I see there's like 29 people have asked questions. So could we, I mean, I know people have given up their Saturday morning for this could we try to cover a few more?
Yes. And this is for you, Karun. It's
Oh,
about
okay.
your it's about your collecting and whether you know whether you have a certain vision about this Asafo Flag collection. Is there a particular genre that you find still missing, or do you have a particular idea to say, okay, this is enough story, or I want to collect this story more? Which direction?
No, I mean, I think it's fascinating collecting textiles, any textile, not just Asafo, because for a lot of arts, you know what's out there and what exists. With what is fascinating about textiles is you just don't know what's coming on the market next, so you are constantly surprised. But having said that, for a number of years, I haven't bought any flags because it's getting very hard to acquire them, because I was traveling there and buying fragments. So now it's very commercial. So it's a dealer's market and serious collectors who are interested in owning one object. And so I'm not adding much to the Asafo flags.
So
I think linking with that, there was a question that I've just seen was about the modern role of collector.
Exactly.
And I think that is very important to me, what that means, because I know people who collect a lot of things, but I think the collectors also need to see and ask themselves questions. Why is it that they're collecting? I mean, I know for a lot of them, it's something to switch off from their reality of life or very hard jobs who are buying objects to keep. But I think we collectors need to be accountable too, because we can't just hoard a lot of material and say we're not going to make it available to the countries where it comes from, not have it available for the young people, not exhibit it, and not publish it, or those who are publishing it are seeing as, oh, they're showing off. So it's about sharing those collections. It's no longer good enough to say, oh, I'm looking after it. But it's also about what are you giving back to these communities? Because there are a lot of collectors in the West who have collected these cultures from Asia, Africa. I mean, what is it you're giving back? So those are the questions I think most collectors need to ask, not simply enjoying it and sharing it with their other friends to show off how much they have, or just having it as simply art, because those responsibilities need to exist, because museums are questioning that, and collectors and dealers, everyone needs to question that.
So the other follow-up question is, how do you keep these flags from deteriorating?
Well, luckily, because most of them are made from cotton, I mean, there are some felt ones, so they don't get moth and so, I have tens of thousands of textiles, so most of them are kept in acid-free tissue and acid-free boxes and so forth. That's how they'll keep them in museums.
So question for Gus, I think. Are these Asafo flags still being used today? And are these military companies still exist?
They absolutely do still exist, and they are still used. And if there are times of the year, particularly in spring and late summer, when there are amazing Asafo flag festivals. So if you were to visit Ghana, that you would see in Anamabu and Cape Coast, particularly, there are periods of the year when all of the flags, including the very long ones that like that Karun showed us, are being kind of flown. And there is something which is amazing about seeing the flags actually animated by the wind. And I can remember watching a young kind of flag dancer using a kind of an old silk flag that had begun to sort of fragment, and just standing downwind from where he was and just being covered in the kind of tiny yellow fragments of the flag as it was disintegrating in the wind. And part of the way in which people are very happy to demonstrate their respect for the flags is to use them to extinction, and that is their privilege, as the owners, and it is a glorious thing to behold, watching standing in say the bay at Cape Coast and watching and seeing hundreds of these flags kind of flapping in the wind, and just seeing people celebrating their history through these beautiful objects.
Okay, great. Karun, there's a question about the format of the flag, I guess, whether the flags are made with fabric sewed on top of other fabrics, and whether they dye the fabric themselves.
Most of them are appliqued. So you have the ground fabric and they put fabric on. I mean, obviously, as I said earlier, they're double-sided. So not only do you have to applique one side, you have to do the other side. So it's quite complex. They mainly use existing fabric, and also they use, as we've seen in the photos, fabrics from other regions and other hand-woven fabrics from other parts of Africa. So there are flags with fabric from Nigeria, Mali, East Africa. And in the later flags, they also started painting on top of the flags. So it's quite interesting to get those later paintings on figures as well.
There's a few questions about iconography. One is about the pointing fingers, and also about the fishing boat, whether they are just decorative or they have any symbolic meaning.
Nothing is just decorative.
Yes.
So
that's what I gather from this talk.
And this is a kind of tradition, and that even if something is there kind of aesthetically, it is referring back to generations of slowly accreted and shifting patterns of change around that particular iconography. But most of the actual kind of flags depict either they are historical events, they are kind of allegorical, they are kind of telling you something about some point of wisdom, something that you need to learn, or they are kind of warnings about something that might happen or that has happened. And so I think from each form there is something to learn, either about the history or about what might happen, or something which is mythological or allegorical. And there is always kind of this idea of history being this kind of this body upon which, if you immerse yourself, that you can grow huge wisdom. And so the flags refer back to that, as well as being the sort of the corporeal, the physical instantiation of that history. And so they are enormously sort of powerful in themselves. And I can remember having an uncle who unfurled one of these flags and told me its story kind of in a deeply kind of emotional way, a man who was kind of very reserved and not someone who would show his emotions, but the way in which these stories kind of link people back to very important passages of their own lives or the lives of their ancestors is just so powerful. And to have something which is both sort of lasting but at the same time fragile, I think is a very powerful way of capturing that.
And also, just to add to that, I mean, I think it's very important, I mean, as you just said, Gus, because flags were, read in various ways. And so if you are looking at them now, so you've got let's say a dealer who's describing it. So, because we don't really know some of what the true meaning was. So some of that has been lost. And then you ask 3 different people now, you get 3 different meanings. So obviously it's every image and every direction the finger was pointed, or the iconography was very important. And some of that meaning, unfortunately, as with so much history in Africa, would have been lost because it hasn't been recorded. And that's something we need to be aware of when we are giving descriptions to a lot of these objects as well.
One question about the flag tradition, whether there is a relationship to the appliqué king list of Benin.
I don't know of any, but yeah.
I don't think it formally, but I think in technique, they are kind of similar. But these are discrete cultures that that this is a tradition that grew up, as a kind of sui generis thing. But one looks at the sorts of the techniques, and one looks at the sort of some of the forms, and you can see kind of similarities. But I don't think that there is a kind of in terms of creative tradition, that there is a connection.
Gus, you mentioned about the flag being performed in dance. So are they also being displayed statically? And also I wonder also how they are being kept when they're not being in performance.
But you do have flag stores and cloth stores, but also that families might keep them, and they would keep them as one might keep linen, that these are kind of precious things that would be folded and loved and repaired, and the damage that they would endure kind of when they were flown, because if an old flag is flown, it's probably going to get torn in these very kind of forceful coastal winds. But you would then, that is part of their story, the repair, the love, the fragility. And so over a period of time that you would get flags, some of which would be more repaired than they would be original material. But that would be the way in which the people who were the custodians of it would feel that they had demonstrated their love for it, and the connection that people have back to that history as a kind of, if you think about our idea of in the West of how we deal with time as being something which is beyond actual definite, you can't capture the present, you can't, the past is gone, the future isn't here, this thing which is so ineffable. But the idea of us investing in something which offers us a grounding continuity that was there in that past, that will be there in our future, that is shared by so many. It was the thing that our grandmother, may have helped to show, that our grandfather may have made the original of it. That those traditions and that continuity, that becomes a way in which one can read and connect to time in such a powerful and palpable way. And that, I think that reading of history is something of a privilege to be a part of. And so that thing that Karun was talking about, that idea of Hegel kind of defining Africa as a place without that kind of, this is a peoples who have understood the complexities of history and the subtlety and the ways in which it can be animated, I think, as powerfully as any culture. And these flags are a beautiful instantiation of that. And to see them as part of a collection like Karun's, or to see them being flown, or to see them in a great museum, I think you get some sense of that.
Thank you. Karun, do you want to say some last words? Because that's a great way of summarizing everything that you have talked about in this discussion.
I mean, I'll say briefly about the show of mine, which is online. Basically, because there's just me. I don't have teams of staff like museums and so on. So the idea of this show was to just start showing the collection, and we had to digitally restore them. So there are about 200 flags on there, and there's the Harley magazine did a wonderful article done by Duncan Clark, so that is on the site as well. And just to sum up, I collect textiles from all sorts of regions, but I think in terms of African textiles, there's some real problem that we need to start facing in museums. That why is it there's so much of African culture on display, and particularly African textiles? So if an individual like me on my own with very limited budget can form this kind of collections. So the institutes need to show some of these pieces, and the importance that we've talked about of these flags, not just in terms of objects from Africa, but in terms of importance in relation to art and contemporary art practice. So I think it's really crucial we start addressing some of those issues, really. And can I also say it's been wonderful to talk to Gus. We have these conversations and we'll just carry on. We could talk for days. So.
We could. But it's such a pleasure, Karun, and I am very happy to take up your gauntlet. I think as a sector, a museum sector, we really have to address these issues. And we are so grateful to you for the sort of amazing pioneering work that you have done. And it is a measure of what an individual can do to completely transform our understanding of a body of work. So we are grateful to you, and well, just thank you. It's such a pleasure and a privilege to have you as a friend, and I look forward to finding lots of ways to collaborate.
Great. And can I thank all the organisers? Thank you for all the hard work you put in behind the scene. Bring this together.
Well, on behalf of the organization, I want to, on behalf of the Phoebe Hearst Museum, the Ethnic Art Council, and the Tracing Patterns Foundation, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your passions, and this is a wonderful way to introduce the Asafo Flags, and also the whole discussion about the African art and how we should approach it going forward. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in.